I signed the divorce papers while my husband was in jail. His mother said, "You're abandoning him." Then his grandmother handed me an envelope and whispered, "He was never building a future with you." His mother said I was cold. His friends said I was the kind of woman who disappeared when a man hit his lowest point. His cousins posted little quotes online about loyalty and marriage, like they had been sitting beside me every night while I cried over overdue bills. They weren't there when the rent was late. They weren't there when I ate toast for dinner because I had used my last money to keep the lights on. They only saw the ending. They saw a wife filing for divorce while her husband sat in jail, and they decided that was the whole story. It wasn't. When Matthew and I first got married, I thought we were just young and struggling like everyone else. I worked long shifts at a hospital in Portland. He had just quit a driving job because he said his manager treated him like he was stupid. I believed him. I wanted to believe him. Back then, every problem still sounded temporary. He would sit at our tiny kitchen table with his laptop open, talking about plans. 1 month it was a delivery business. Then flipping cars. Then a food truck. Then a clothing brand. Then moving to Seattle because some guy knew investors. He always made it sound close. Just one more connection. One more idea. One more break. And I kept telling myself supporting him was what a good wife did. I picked up extra shifts. I skipped buying things I needed. I told my friends we were fine. I told my family Matthew was working on something big, even though most days the only thing he worked on was explaining why normal jobs were beneath him. He wouldn't go back to driving because he said it was dead-end work. He wouldn't take a warehouse job because he said it would ruin his body. He wouldn't work retail because customers were disrespectful. He wouldn't deliver food because someone from school might see him. Every job had a reason. Every bill had my name on it. At first, he seemed embarrassed. He would say, "I know you're carrying a lot right now. I'm going to make it up to you." Then, little by little, his embarrassment turned into entitlement. If I asked him to help with rent, he said I was pressuring him. If I asked whether he had applied anywhere, he said I didn't believe in him. If I cried after a double shift, he said I was making him feel like a failure. And somehow, I always ended up apologizing. That's one of the hardest parts to admit. I apologized for being tired. I apologized for being scared. I apologized for needing my own husband to act like an adult. His grandparents, Susan and Charles, noticed before anyone else did. They never said it in a cruel way. Susan would invite us over and send me home with groceries, pretending she had bought too much. Charles would slip me gas money in the driveway and say, "Don't argue with an old man." I always argued anyway, but not very hard, because by then I needed it. Matthew hated it when they helped us, but not enough to stop taking the help. He would complain in the car afterward and say, "They think I'm useless." I never knew what to say to that, because they didn't think it. They could see it. One night, after Susan gave me 2 bags of groceries and a container of soup, Matthew threw the soup into the fridge so hard the lid cracked. I said, "Why are you mad?" "She's helping us." He said, "She's helping you. There's a difference." That sentence stayed with me because it was the first time I realized he knew I was the one drowning. He knew I was the one being saved. He just hated that someone else could see it. The arrest didn't come out of nowhere. I wish I could say it shocked me completely, but that would be a lie. Matthew had started spending more time with Anthony, an old friend who always had some fast money idea. Anthony still worked odd driving jobs, but he talked like he was a businessman who just hadn't been discovered yet. He wore nice shoes he couldn't afford and used words like networking and opportunity whenever he meant risky. I didn't like him. Neither did Charles. One Sunday, we were at Susan and Charles's house and Matthew started talking about going to Seattle with Anthony to meet some guy about a business connection. He was vague in that way he always got when he wanted me to stop asking questions. I asked, "What kind of business connection?" He said, "You wouldn't get it." Charles looked up from his coffee and said, "Then explain it better." Matthew laughed, but it was tight. Not everything is a scam just because it doesn't involve punching a clock. Charles didn't blink. Real opportunities can survive a few questions. The room went quiet. On the drive home, Matthew said I embarrassed him because I didn't defend him. I said I wasn't going to defend something he wouldn't even explain. That turned into a 2-hour argument in our apartment. He paced around the living room, saying I was small-minded, saying I liked him dependent because it made me feel superior. I remember standing by the sink, still in my coat, thinking, I am working myself sick to keep this man fed, and he thinks I enjoy this. A few weeks later, he was arrested. I won't go into every legal detail because it was stupid, messy, and tied to people I don't want near my life again. It wasn't some movie-level crime. It was exactly what Charles warned him about. A reckless situation with reckless people, sold to him as easy money. When I got the call, my knees went weak. I didn't cry right away. I just stood in the hospital break room with my phone in my hand while Lisa, one of the nurses I worked with, asked if I was okay. I said, I think my husband got arrested. The words didn't feel real. Then everything became noise. His mother, Nancy, called me screaming before I even understood what happened. She asked what I was going to do. She asked if I had spoken to a lawyer. She asked if I had money for him. She asked why I sounded so calm. I wasn't calm. I was frozen. The first few days were a blur of phone calls, paperwork, court dates, and humiliation. I had to ask for time off work. I had to explain enough without explaining everything. I had to sit in a courtroom by myself while Nancy cried loudly beside me and acted like I had personally failed her son. Matthew's friends disappeared fast. The same men who had called him a visionary suddenly didn't know much. Anthony stopped answering his phone. People who had been at our apartment eating food I bought were suddenly too busy to send a text. But I was expected to show up. I was expected to be the wife. So I showed up. I answered his calls from jail. I put money on his account. I listened when he cried. He said he was scared. He said he was sorry. He said he finally understood how much I had done for him. The first time he said that, I broke. I sat on the bathroom floor after the call and cried into a towel because I didn't want our neighbors to hear me. Part of me wanted to believe this was rock bottom, the ugly place people hit before they change. He said, when I get out, I'll do anything. I'll work anywhere. I'll go to counseling. I'll be the husband you deserve. I held the phone so tightly my fingers hurt. I said, I can't keep doing this. He said, I know. I know, baby. I'm going to fix it. For a little while, those words kept me standing. Then the calls changed. He stopped asking how I was sleeping. He stopped asking if I was eating. He started asking why I missed his calls while I was working. Why I hadn't visited that weekend. Why I didn't sound more emotional. Why I only put a small amount of money on his account. One night, after a 12-hour shift, I answered because I felt guilty. He said, you sound annoyed. I said, I'm tired. He said, I'm in jail, Jessica. Like that ended the conversation. Like nothing I felt could matter because his suffering was bigger. I closed my eyes and leaned against the kitchen counter. He said, other wives stand by their husbands. I said, I've been standing by you for years. He got quiet, then said, don't start acting like you're perfect now. That was the moment something inside me shifted. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just a small click. I looked around our apartment. The unpaid bill on the table. The laundry I had no energy to fold. The empty side of the couch where he used to sit and tell me I didn't support him. And I realized jail hadn't created this loneliness. It had only made it easier to see. Susan called me the next morning and asked me to come over. I almost didn't go. I was ashamed. I thought she would ask me to be patient. I thought she would tell me marriage was hard and Matthew needed me. Instead, she opened the door, took one look at me, and pulled me into her arms. I cried in her hallway like a child. Charles was in the kitchen, sitting at the table with coffee he hadn't touched. He looked older than he had a month before. Susan made tea. Nobody rushed me. Finally, I said, I don't know how much longer I can do this. Susan reached across the table and held my hand. She said, then don't confuse his consequences with your vows. I stared at her. Charles said, we love our grandson. But love doesn't mean pretending he hasn't been standing on your shoulders and calling it ambition. That sentence hit me so hard I couldn't speak. Because that was exactly what it was. For years, Matthew had climbed over my exhaustion and called it progress. He had used my paycheck as a safety net and my patience as proof that he was special. And now that the fantasy had collapsed, he still wanted me underneath him, holding everything up. I started seeing Dr. Elizabeth through a support program connected to work. I didn't tell anyone at first because I felt embarrassed, like therapy meant I had failed. But sitting in that small office, I realized how badly I needed one place where I didn't have to defend Matthew before I could talk about myself. Dr. Elizabeth didn't tell me to leave him. She asked questions that made me uncomfortable. What do you want your life to feel like? I didn't have an answer. What would change if Matthew came home tomorrow? I wanted to say everything. But the honest answer was nothing. I would still be scared of bills. Still careful with my words. Still shrinking my needs so he could feel bigger. She asked, do you feel safe being honest with him? I cried because the answer was no. Not physically unsafe. Not like that. But emotionally no. I had learned to edit myself. To soften every complaint. To turn every need into a joke. To ask for basic help like I was asking for luxury. That does something to you. It makes you disappear in pieces. I didn't file right away. I wish I could say I was brave enough to walk straight from therapy to a lawyer's office, but I wasn't. I waited. I prayed. I made lists. I read articles about divorce. I looked at our bank account and laughed because there was almost nothing to divide except debt and resentment. Then Nancy called me one night and told me I needed to visit Matthew more. I said, I'm working. She said, he's your husband. I said, I know who he is. She snapped, then act like it. Something about that broke the last thread. Not because Nancy mattered that much, but because I heard myself almost apologize again. The words were right there ready. Sorry. Sorry I'm tired. Sorry I'm not enough. Sorry your son destroyed our life, and I'm not decorating the wreckage nicely enough for everyone. Instead, I said, I'm done being the only person responsible for him. She went silent. Then she said, if you leave him now, everyone will know what kind of woman you are. I said, maybe they will. My hands shook after I hung up, but underneath the fear was something else. Relief. I met Barbara, a divorce lawyer, at a small office in Portland a week later. I wore the only blazer I owned and brought a folder full of documents, bills, bank statements, lease papers, pay stubs, and printed messages I had saved without knowing why. Barbara didn't react dramatically. She just read quietly, asked practical questions, and explained what the process would look like. At the end, she said, you're allowed to make decisions based on the life you actually have, not the one he keeps promising. I nodded like I understood, but I cried in my car for 20 minutes before I could drive home. Filing felt both terrifying and boring. That surprised me. I expected thunder. I expected some huge emotional moment. Instead, it was paperwork. Sign here. Initial there. Confirm the address. Pay the fee. I signed the papers with a cheap black pen. My hand shook, but I signed. When Matthew found out, he called over and over until I answered. The moment his voice came through, I knew someone had told him. He didn't cry that time. He said, are you serious? I said, yes. He said, you're divorcing me while I'm locked up? I swallowed hard. I'm divorcing you because I can't live like this anymore. He laughed once, sharp and ugly. Wow. So this is who you are. I gripped the phone. No. This is who I became after years of carrying you. He said, don't rewrite history. You liked feeling better than me. That hurt more than I wanted it to. Not because it was true, but because he knew exactly where to aim. He knew I hated being seen as cruel. He knew I had spent years trying not to make him feel small. He said, I would never leave you at your lowest. And for the first time, I didn't protect him from the truth. I said, you left me at mine every day. You were just still in the room. He went quiet. Then he said, my mother was right about you. I ended the call. After that, the backlash came fast. Nancy texted me paragraphs about vows. She said marriage wasn't just for easy times. She said Matthew needed hope. She said I was embarrassing the family. I wanted to reply with every receipt I had. I wanted to send her screenshots of the rent payments, the grocery charges, the times Matthew asked me for money while calling me unsupportive. I wanted to ask why her version of loyalty only seemed to involve my suffering. But I didn't. Because there is no perfect evidence that makes people respect your pain when they benefit from misunderstanding it. Matthew's friends posted things online about modern women giving up on men. One of his cousins unfollowed me after sharing a quote about wives who only love success. Someone messaged me and said, you'll regret this when he gets out better. Maybe he will get better. I hope he does. But I finally understood that he did not need me as a wife. He needed me as a cushion. Something soft to land on every time his pride pushed him off another ledge. The only people I went to in person were Susan and Charles. I felt I owed them that. They had helped me quietly for years, and I didn't want them hearing about the divorce from Nancy's version of events. When I arrived, Susan already looked like she knew. She made tea anyway. I sat at the kitchen table and said, I filed. My voice cracked on the second word. Charles let out a slow breath. Susan closed her eyes for a second, then opened them and looked at me with so much sadness and kindness that I almost fell apart. I said, I'm sorry. Susan said, don't apologize for surviving something we watched happen. That broke me worse than anger would have. I told them I loved them. I told them I didn't want them to feel like I was turning my back on the family. I told them I knew Matthew was their grandson, and I would never ask them to choose. Charles leaned back in his chair and said, he made choices long before you did. Then Susan stood and went into the hallway closet. She came back with a small cardboard box and placed it on the table. Inside were things I had left at their house over the years. A sweater. A book. A Christmas ornament Susan had bought me. A framed picture from one Thanksgiving where I looked exhausted, but was still smiling. At the bottom was an envelope with my name on it. I stared at it. Susan said, take it. I opened it and found a check. Not enough to change my whole life, but enough to cover a deposit on a new place and help me breathe for the first time in months. I shook my head. I can't take this. Charles said, you can. I said, Matthew will be furious. Susan's mouth tightened. Matthew has been furious every time someone helped you instead of feeding his pride. I looked down at the check again. Susan said, we helped him for years. Let us help you once without guilt. I cried then. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just the kind of crying that comes when someone finally sees the whole weight and doesn't ask you to carry it prettier. That's when she said the thing I still hear sometimes. He was never building a future with you. He was building one on top of you. 2 weeks later, I moved out. There wasn't much to pack. Most of the furniture was cheap, secondhand, or too connected to memories I didn't want. I took my clothes, my documents, some kitchen things, and the ornament Susan gave me. Lisa helped me carry boxes into my new apartment. It was a small one-bedroom in Portland with bad water pressure and a neighbor upstairs who walked like he was moving furniture every night. The kitchen cabinet stuck. The bedroom window faced a brick wall. But when Lisa left and I stood there alone, holding a roll of paper towels and a plastic bag full of cleaning supplies, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Stillness. No one was on the couch waiting to tell me I didn't believe in him. No one was asking what was for dinner with no money for groceries. No one was turning my exhaustion into an insult against his dreams. For the first time, the silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like space. Matthew kept calling for a while. I stopped answering. Then the letters came. The first one was angry. He said I had humiliated him. He said men in jail still had wives who cared. He said I cared too much about money and not enough about loyalty. The second one was softer. He said he missed me. He said he had been thinking about everything. He said he could see now that he took me for granted. The third one was the worst because it sounded almost right. He wrote that prison had changed him. He wrote that he understood pain now. He wrote that he wanted to be the man I deserved. Then, near the end, he wrote, "But you changed too, Jessica. You got colder. You let other people convince you I was the problem." I read that line 3 times. Then I folded the letter and put it in a drawer. Not because I'm saving it with love. I'm saving it because I need to remember how blame can dress itself up as growth. The divorce is still moving through the process. It isn't clean yet. Nothing about this has been clean. Nancy still thinks I betrayed her son. Some people still think I should have waited until he got out. Maybe some people will always believe leaving during jail time is unforgivable, no matter what came before it. I understand why it looks bad from the outside. A wife filing for divorce while her husband is behind bars sounds harsh if you remove the years before it. It sounds cruel if you ignore the nights I stayed up calculating which bill could be late. It sounds disloyal if you pretend loyalty means letting someone keep using your life as a backup plan. I'm not saying I handled everything perfectly. I stayed too long. I lied when people asked if we were okay. I protected Matthew's image while mine disappeared. I let myself become the patient wife, the strong wife, the wife who could handle anything. And maybe part of me liked feeling needed until I realized being needed is not the same as being loved. Last week, I came home after a long shift, took off my shoes by the door, and made myself dinner. Nothing special. Just pasta and toast. I sat on the floor because I still didn't have a proper table, and I opened my laptop to finish something I had been putting off for weeks. Halfway through, I realized my chest didn't hurt. There was no dread. No waiting for footsteps. No rehearsing how to ask for help without starting a fight. No pretending someone else's potential mattered more than my reality. Just quiet. Not happiness exactly. Not yet. But quiet. And quiet, after years of chaos, feels like the first honest kind of peace. I don't know what Matthew will become. Maybe jail really will change him. Maybe he'll get out, find steady work, apologize to everyone, and become the man he kept promising me he would be. But I don't think I have to be the reward waiting at the end of his lesson. I don't think love means standing in the fire just because the person holding the match is crying now. So I signed the papers. Not to punish him. Not to humiliate him. Not because I stopped caring overnight. I signed them because I finally understood that his lowest point did not erase mine. And if that makes me cold to some people, maybe cold is what survival feels like before it turns into peace. So was I wrong for divorcing my husband while he was in jail, after years of carrying the marriage alone, or did I finally leave the moment I should have left a long time ago?